Welcome to Female Reproductive System. Here we're going to talk about a lot of things, and I have a list on the right in case you're taking notes separate from the lecture notes in the order that will go, and hopefully this will be useful so that whenever you refer back to your notes, you can help put it all together. So we'll start with a couple disclaimers, then we'll move into the anatomy of the female repro tract, then the cycles, the 3 different cycles, hormonal regulation, then a summary chart to put it all together. Hopefully that'll be helpful. Then we'll go into sexual function, fertilization, contraception, STIs, development, aging, and homeostasis for both males and females. So why do I start with disclaimers? Well, it might feel like this unit requires or spends a lot of attention on the female reproductive system and not so much on the male reproductive system. And this isn't necessarily by choice. This is more that the female reproductive system tends to be a little bit more complicated than the male reproductive system. I find it kind of ironic also because we learn the male reproductive system typically first before the female repro system, even though developmentally the preset is always female and you have to have the Y chromosome in order to turn things male. And if you don't have the Y chromosome, things would automatically go female regardless of what's going on. So I find it kind of funny that we start with male repro knowing this, but it makes sense because the male repro tends to be a little bit more simple, a little easier to visualize, and there's only one cycle that you really have to pay attention to, versus with the female we have to add a lot of things on and kind of layer it specifically. Other disclaimers, I get very excited about this unit. And I will share probably a lot of extra information, but I'll be sure to highlight what things you do and don't need to know for the lecture exam. Why do I do this? Because from my experience, I've never experienced one person that just knew everything about the female repro system and didn't have any questions or didn't hear any weird myths or whatever crap that there is out there. And so I think it's really important and almost a responsibility for both sexes to know what's going on for both for the opposite sex. Also, I didn't mention this for the male repro system, but whenever I refer to male, I am referring to the genetic composition, the XY, and when I'm referring to female, I'm again referring to XX. But there is a wide spectrum. There is a lot of interesting phenotypic differences, hormonal differences, nuclei responsiveness differences in the brain, and so there's a very large spectrum. But whenever you're first learning this material, it's easier to start like this and then add on the information as we go. So I'll try to include some information from my previous experiences and other readings for non-binary type sexes. Another piece, this isn't really a disclaimer, but there's this awesome book called the Vagina Bible, and it's not religious, but it is a thorough, well-written book with many chapters. Actually, let me pull it up here. It is written by a gynecologist. It was published last year, and she is very thorough in what she talks about. She gives a lot of really good information, really good in-depth information. I've learned a lot about extra things that you wouldn't necessarily learn at the doctor's office because there's just not enough time. She goes into really good details about myths, debunking myths, everything that weird things you've seen on Netflix to weird things you've seen on the internet, and should I buy this, should I not buy this, is this useful for me, so on and so forth. It is an awesome book, so I highly recommend it, and she cites her sources, and I mean, it's awesome. I think there's a total of, let's see how many chapters, 46 chapters, so I'm not even finished with it. I try to read it in my free time whenever I'm in the mood for it, so there's a lot in there. Okay, let's go back to this. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. We'll get to oogenesis. I'm going to scoot this over to the side, and we'll focus on the anatomy. So for females, anterior is to the left, posterior is to the right. And let's go from anterior to posterior. So first you have the urethra. That's connected to our urinary bladder, and that's where urine is going to be released from. Then you have the vaginal canal. And the vaginal canal is met superiorly by the cervix, which is the neck of the opening of the the uterus. The uterus is a muscular organ. You can see it's a lot thicker than the urinary bladder. The urinary bladder we also learned was a muscular organ. And the uterus usually sits or flexes forward like that in 75% of women, I believe. It sits anteriorly like that, but the other 25% it actually sits posteriorly. So there are considerations whenever you are putting in like an IUD, for example, because it has to pass through that cervix, and it may be more comfortable if the patient is aware what direction the uterus sits in. It also doesn't necessarily sit symmetric, or it doesn't sit quite on midline. Sometimes it can turn to the left and a little to the right. In younger women, this is relatively small. In older women, it shrinks back to a smaller size again as well. And of course, throughout the reproductive years, if you're having children, this will grow. But usually it shrinks back down in later in life. And then most posteriorly, then we have the anal canal and the rectum. So from anterior to posterior, you have 3 holes, versus males, we only had 2. And we had the urethra, vagina, and then the anus. So please do not get those confused. We'll talk into detail about the layers of the uterus and some glands and what the inferior view of this looks like. But let's go ahead and continue on with how we actually hold all this stuff in place. So stabilizing structures, we've got the broad ligament. The broad ligament is covering pretty much everything and strapping it inferiorly and laterally. So it's covering the ovaries, the uterine tubes, formerly known as fallopian tubes, but we're going to call them uterine tubes, and the uterus. And this is preventing side-to-side movement. So this is all retroperitoneal, and it doesn't have any mesenteries or any of those folds or augmentums to hold it in. So these are what we use in the pelvis in order to keep things in place. The ovary specifically also has its own sets of supports. We have the mesovarium, ovarian ligament, and suspensory ligament. So the ovarian ligament attaches uterus to uterine tube, so this is a medial connection. The suspensory ligament is connecting it laterally, and then the mesovarium is kind of a extra layer on top of everything that helps separate it from the rest of the tissues. The ovary itself is not actually directly attached to the uterine tube. There is space in between the two, and so this is why we have to have a separate set of ligaments holding it in place. The ovary's functions are to make oocytes, make estrogens and progesterone. When we say estrogens, there are different forms of estrogen, like estradiol, estrogen. There's another one that I forget. I usually abbreviate it as E, like I did with testosterone, T. But you might see E2 in the literature, you might see E1 in the literature. We don't expect you to know the differences between all of those, just refer to them as estrogen. The ovaries are also going to be secreting inhibin, and we'll talk about which cells specifically do that. The visceral peritoneum on top of the tunica albuginea. So this is analogous structures to the in the testes. We have columnar epithelial here, and this is dense connective tissue for the ovary. So just superficial structure, superficial lining. Internally, we have a stroma, and in the stroma, you'll see the difference between the cortex and the medulla. This is not as clear-cut as we compare it to the kidney, like where you can visually see that even with the naked eye. It's a little bit more difficult to tell, especially in reproductive years in a human cadaver, and even on the models and like cartoonistic pictures that we have. It's not quite clearly differentiated, but if anything is pointing towards the outside, that's cortex, and if anything is pointing towards the inside, it's medulla. But there's a little bit of overlap. The cells aren't quite like in a perfect line or perfect layers. And then the oocytes are made in the cortex. They get some support that once they're done and then they get released from the ovary, then the remaining tissues get left into the medulla, and then they form scar tissue. And we'll talk about that whenever we get there too. Okay, uterine tubes. We have it's a paired sets of tubes, and these are going laterally from the uterus. There's 3 parts to the uterine tube. From lateral to medial, you have the infundibulum. So the infundibulum has some fimbriae, which are finger-like looking projections. They are waiting for the ovary to release the egg and to catch it. Then at the end of the infundibulum, you have the ampulla. So just like other ampullas, it's like a goblet-shaped funnel area. Typically, fertilization occurs here, but it doesn't always necessarily. It's just the majority of the time fertilization happens here. So this is where the sperm actually meets egg. Then the isthmus, this is the long part where we typically show in the diagrams. This is like the long arms coming back into the uterus, and if the ovaries are over here. Okay, the lining of the uterine tube. Again, we have ciliated columnar epithelial cells here. We have some mucin-secreting cells, so we're secreting mucus. Goodness. You have a layer of smooth muscle. The uterine tubes are actually able to make peristaltic contractions. I mentioned earlier that it's still unclear why sperm actually are able to find the egg. One of the educated guesses of how sperm are able to find egg, because they're whipping their tails, they don't really have like a direction to go to, and it's not quite clear if they're following some sort of chemical gradient. But it has been proposed that they follow a temperature gradient, or that the uterine tubes actually contract and help push egg towards sperm and vice versa. And we know that they do peristaltic contractions, but outside of actually promoting fertilization, we're not sure why else this would be of use. The lining is nutrient rich with lipids and glycogen. This is super important because this is where sperm go through capacitation, and part of their process of capacitation, so that they can receive those last bits of nutrients so that they're fully prepared to penetrate the egg. We have PEG cells. These are secreting fluid, again, to help with capacitation and supply nutrients. So don't worry about PEG cells. That's some very specific information. All right, then the uterus. So most medial, we've got one of these. The purpose, or the function, I should say, are to protect, nourish, and remove waste for a developing embryo and or fetus. If there is no developing embryo and or fetus, then it's there to receive the unfertilized egg and to shed it during menses. It's a small pear-shaped organ. It typically bends anteriorly, like I said, so that's anteflexion, and then 25% are retroflexed or retroflexion. You have ligaments for the uterus as well, uterosacral, so uterus to sacrum ligaments. You have round ligaments. This is going through the inguinal canal, so this is analogous to the spermatic cord. This is just helping strap it in inferiorly. Cardinal ligaments and pelvic floor muscles. So the cardinal ligaments are, like, you can't really even see them with the naked eye, but the pelvic floor muscles are really important because they help stabilize the inferior structures of the uterus. So that includes the vagina and the cervix. And so it's really important to practice pelvic floor exercises to help stabilize all of the structures inferiorly. The uterus has fundus, body, isthmus, and cervix. So fundus, just like we've learned, I don't know why it's spelled fundas. It should be fundus. Sorry about that. Fundus is going to be the top portion. Body is going to be the main portion. Then you have the cervix, which is the neck, and leading into the neck is going to be the isthmus. The cervix itself is tubular, so like a pear-shaped tube. If you carved out a pear, that would be almost a tube. And it enters, the cervix is tubular, excuse me. And it enters the superior portion of the vagina. And if we were to draw the vagina like this and the uterus up like this, the cervix is actually going to kind of wrap around like this, and kind of almost like not a wine stopper, but oh gosh, what are those called? Like if a wine stopper had a rim around it and it was grabbing on top of the wine bottle, that would be like the cervix. We have some better views coming up here in a second. You have the external and the internal os of the uterus. So external os, this is going directly into the cervical canal. You'll be able to see this on the models much better than in the pictures here. And then this also opens, then the uterine cavity has the internal os. So the internal os is more superior than the external os. Blood supply, uterus has its own specific blood supply. You have uterine arteries, which are branches from the internal iliac arteries. You have the ovarian arteries, which are from the abdominal aorta. So the ovarian arteries are those gonadal arteries that we learned that come right in between, that come off the abdominal aorta in between superior and inferior mesenterics. Nervous supply, you have sympathetics and parasympathetics. The sympathetics are from a hypogastric plexus, which we don't identify in chapter 24, but hypogastric, so you can imagine inferior to the stomach region. Parasympathetics are from sacral segments. This is also really interesting because recently anatomists have but they have differentiated that there are no parasympathetics in the pelvic region, which makes things confusing for the reproductive unit. So we'll go with what your textbook says now, but just know that that is a discrepancy in the literature. We have sensory info from T11, T12. So this is autonomics and autonomics and input to the primary somatosensory cortex. Okay, so some pictures. Let's work with the top picture first. So we're looking at an anterior view, and we could see on the right side, we can actually see the ligaments covering and holding things in place. You can see that the ovary is actually drawn inferior to the uterine tube, and it looks like the fimbriae are actually holding onto it, but this is not the case. The picture on the left-hand side of the picture is actually a little bit more representative of what's going on. So if we look at the left-hand side, you can see the vasculature really nicely. Everything is in close proximity, and there's lots of vasculature here. The fimbriae, infundibulum, and ampulla are nicely identified as well. The ampulla looks a lot more straight than funnel-shaped in this view. So once we see it in the cadaver picture, you'll be able to tell a bigger difference there. And then you can see the ovary, and they're even showing you the different stages of the oocyte development in there. For the uterus, there are different layers. So myometrium is that muscular layer, myo meaning muscle, endo meaning within, so this is the inner layer, and then perimetrium, peri meaning surrounding. So those are our 3 layers. We'll talk about those. Okay, internal and external os. So we can see that the internal os is superior, external os is inferior, and you can see that, like I said, it's kind of like a wine stopper with some help around the edges, and the vagina sits inferior to this. So the reason why I make a emphasis on the wine stopper analogy is because during sexual or during vaginal intercourse, you might think that you've you had sex 3 days ago, and that you're fine and that you're not pregnant, but sperm can actually live in the reproductive tract up to 5 to 7 days. I've seen both numbers in the literature. And one of the best places that they can, I don't want to say hide, but hang out in are this crux. So if this is this and this is this, you can actually see them hiding like this. In the inferior picture, you can see anterior is bottom, posterior is top of the picture, and you can see the urinary bladder for reference. And then you can see all of the supporting ligaments in a cartoonistic depiction. And then on the right-hand side, they're trying to show you what it looks like in the cadaver. The ovaries are actually really, really small in the cadaver. They might be the size of like a quarter, if not smaller. And then the uterus is a lot larger than the urinary bladder typically. You can also see the fimbriae nicely here too. They're not labeled, but the fimbriae, if you're looking at the right-hand side uterus, uterine tube, let's see, it's not dissected very well, actually. It's not dissected on the right side, it's dissected on the left side. But within here, somewhere the ovary is going to be, and then you can actually see parts of the fimbriae right in here, which is cool. Okay. All right, so uterine wall, let's talk about the importance of the uterine wall. So it has variable thickness in people, and this can make a difference in how easy it is or how feasible it is to have a vaginal delivery. You have an incomplete serosal layer. This is I don't know the functionality of this, but my guess would be so that it can still receive hormonal signals from the vasculature surrounding the pelvic floor. That would just be my guess, but I'm not sure. The middle muscular layer, the myometrium, is going to be the thickest portion, and we can see that there's a lot of vascularization here, which makes sense. The muscles need O2 to contract, or to get ATP in order to make contractions, so that makes sense. I want us to pay attention to the arteries here. So the inside is to the left, the outside is to the right, and you can see the endometrium is kind of this purple layer. And we can see that there's a lot of extravascularization there too, which also makes sense because we need to send hormonal signals back and forth of what's going on. Then we can see some straight arteries, and we can see those are coming off of spiral arteries. And during menses, what we'll learn is that the spiral arteries will actually constrict, and then that remaining blood flow doesn't have any incoming or any input, new blood coming in. And so that's part of the reason of why it sheds, is those spiral arteries actually cinch themselves off and then rebuild straight arteries during every cycle, which is just fascinating. That's crazy to me. Here's a view, let's see here. Yeah, same view. So on the left side is internal, on the right side is external, and you can see the uterine glands really well here too. Uterine glands are going to be really important because they'll be secreting mucus, which will be really helpful if in case a fertilized zygote can implant itself somewhere. So it has a cushion, let's say, and it makes it sticky so that it stays there. The endometrium has two specific layers, a functional layer and a basal layer. This will be important to understand because the functional layer is the layer that leaves during menses, but the basal layer is the one that stays. The functional layer is where you'll see uterine glands. You should not see uterine glands in the basal layer, and this will make a lot more sense whenever we look at some of our slides for the lab portion. Then inferior, moving down to the vagina. The vagina is an elastic muscular tube, so this is analogous to the tubular organ for the males, which is the penis. They are... I'm not going to say that. This is the passageway for menstrual fluids as they exit, and then this is the passageway for the penis during vaginal intercourse as it receives it. Like I said, it can hold sperm for a couple of days before the sperm can actually find their way through the cervix. In the vaginal fornix, fornix means entryway, so similar to a vestibule. So like a vestibule could be like the big archway into a house, but the fornix would be like the double arches that you might have to walk through if there's like a set of doors here. So that's what fornix means. Forms the inferior portion of the birth canal. So if there's a vaginal delivery, the baby would exit through here. The vagina is a very muscular organ. It is ribbed, and it is very resistant to change. It's very, I shouldn't say stretchy, but it's able to stretch really well, which makes sense because we have a lot of stratified squamous epithelium here, so they are able to change shape really easily. We secrete a lot of mucus in this area as well. It has its own pH and bacterial environment that's very different than the rest of the female reproductive tract, which is really important. During vaginal delivery, which is the preferred method, as the baby exits, this is the first set of bacteria that will actually ever be exposed to in the environment. And this is really, really healthy and good bacteria for the baby, and it usually helps develop its immune system a lot quicker than what would be like a C-section or cutting through the uterus in order to retrieve the baby. Let's see here. Lots of blood vessels, lots of smooth muscle cells. What else do I want to say? I think that's it. I think that's all I want to talk about right now. Oh, hymen. Let's talk about the hymen. So the hymen is not represented in this picture. It's pointing to where it would be. And this is a cutaway view. So the hymen would have been a thin layer of tissue at that, like in a transverse cut from that view. The hymen is not always present in all women. And the hymen is what is typically thought of as the, popping the cherry, I think. Or breaking the cherry. I don't know what it is anymore. But this is where women who have had penetrative sex and either with toys or penis or fingers, etc., etc., if the hymen breaks, that there might be some blood leaving, but that's not always the case for everyone. And like I said, it's not even present in all women either. Some women break it horseback riding, playing soccer, running, bicycling. It's not always consistent with sex or penetrative sex. And the fact that the hymen is not present in all women, there are some evolutionary biologists who are arguing that the hymen might be something that is receding and is becoming a vestigial trait. So similar to like our tailbone and our floating ribs, that they don't really serve as much of a purpose anymore as they might have in our ancestral lineage. One of the theories that I've read is that the hymen was present for us whenever we were more quadrupeds, and we were closer, the pelvis was closer to the ground and therefore closer to dirt, debris, extra bacteria, and so on. So this was just an extra helpful lining to prevent anything from getting into the vaginal canal. But like I said, this is just a theory, so it's just fun facts for 500. Okay. All right, so an inferior view, anteriors to the top, posteriors to the bottom. And let's go through this one by one. So we can see the opening to the vagina, which is located within the vestibule. We can see the vaginal entrance there, which is in between the urethral opening, which is anterior, and the anal entrance, which is posterior. The vestibule also contains the labia minora, so minora meaning smaller than the majora, and the urethral opening is also within the vestibule. It says the hymen's torn in this view, but like we just talked about the hymen. Anteriorly, you'll have the prepuce, and the prepuce we talked about in the male reproductive system too. This is equivalent to the foreskin. The prepuce, like I said, is the Pope's hat. Fun name. And just under the prepuce, you can find the clitoris, the glans clitoris specifically. This is a bulbar structure, and it is we can find it outside of the pelvic cavity, but actually deep to it is a larger section of nerve endings and nerve bundles that are actually part of the clitoris that are also engorged during stimulation. Let's see here. So we have some muscles that help keep everything in place down here as well. So we have two bulbospongiosus muscles. These are analogous to the male as well. These will help constrict the entrance of the vagina. And the additional muscles that cover on top of it are also erectile tissue. Let's see here. Oh, let's talk about the mons pubis for a second. So in America, people love to get rid of mons pubis in a variety of ways, but structure usually equals function, and there's a purpose for it being there, and it's protective. It helps prevent